So a quick introduction. I'm Joel Morgan, Senior Solutions Architect at Amazon Web Services. And today we're talking about accessing data on AWS. So we have, I know I've gone over in the past how to get data, or that ways to store data on AWS. And it all sounds simple and fun until you realize, oh, well, this is not exactly the same as dragging and dropping a file to another folder on my laptop. So that's what I'm here to talk about today. Please feel free to ask questions via either via chat or just come off mute. There's not like 100 of us in here in the room, so feel free to jump in. One thing I'll set up front, I'm going to focus on data storage today as opposed to accessing data that might be like in a database. I can do that at a later time. We have plenty of topics, and if anybody in the audience has something that they would like to talk about or hear about in the future, please let us know. When it comes to accessing data like that's in a database or maybe on a virtual compute platform like EC2, there's lots of different ways to do that, but this would go for like 4 hours if I did everything at once. So we're going to start with just the basics of data. Okay, this is a giant S3 bucket. S3, which if you're unfamiliar, is the simple storage service. There is no S2, there's no S4. It is 3 S's in an acronym, so we call it S3.
Oh, screen.
Is it not?
No.
Oh, it's on. There we go. Okay. So a bucket is the logical delineation of data in S3. I know at least 2 people here have used S3 before. I'm assuming Jeff has. Okay.
I do.
Okay. Now, just very quickly, before I move on, S3 is an object store, which pre-AWS is a thing that existed. It's a concept that existed, not super common, unless you were an application developer or you were a storage administrator at a large enterprise. You wouldn't have run into an object store. Now, what makes that different than a file system is that it's made to be accessed programmatic, right? It uses basically HTTP verbs, almost like REST, where it's put, get, copy, delete, things like that. Right? You're not really modifying a file when you open it on S3. You're downloading it, right? So just level set there. S3 is different than a file system because it's an object store. I probably beat this to death every time I talk about S3 in public, but I just like people to know that. So because it's made to be accessed programmatically, there are nuances to how you want to do it. Now, all of you are way more concerned, and rightfully so, with making sure your data is safe, making sure your data is available, and doing science. It's the whole point of all of this, right? I'm not talking to IT administrators, right? So it may not be familiar, and it may not be something that you want to read pages and pages of documentation on, but it doesn't have to be difficult. So step 1 is the AWS console. This is So this is what it looks like when you log into the AWS console with your AWS account and you go to S3. This is a bucket. My bucket, that's my email address, joelmorg-, and then there's something else, but I blacked it out because one thing about S3 buckets, not the point of the story, but S3 buckets are globally unique. So even though it's private, it's still not a great idea to like tell people your S3 bucket name unless you want them to find it and download stuff. Once again, that's a different discussion, but this is what it looks like. Right? So you have options. Here I've clicked on my bucket. If I were to show you the actual page with all of my buckets, you would see that a horrifying list of buckets because this is my lab environment, but you would see a list of your buckets and you can have as many buckets as you'd like. It's good to kind of mitigate bucket sprawl, but at the same time, you're not pre-provisioning space. You're not saying, I need this much space for data, so I should allocate this much. No, just you put data into it. That's it. Pay for what you use. But this is the interface. Now, if you've ever used S3 at all, you've probably seen this interface. You can see these are objects in my bucket. These are actually all things I have sent people, including like this one, to all of you at one point. So these are objects in my S3 bucket. You can see they're all different file types. Are they? Yes. Okay, good. I was going to say I've got at least more than one. It's not just PDFs there. So I have, and this, if you use a Mac, you'll understand why that's there later, but very easy to use. So you have a bright orange button, upload. You can create folder. Creating folders, I use a lot of air quotes, don't actually exist in S3, but they will look like they do when you go through the web interface. So a folder is really just the name of the folder prepended on the name of the object with a delimiter, like a / So if I had a subfolder, it would be like folder name / 2023 reInvent recap PDF. That would be the entire object name. Now, once again, I'm kind of going off track here, but this is very easy to use, much easier than it used to be. These are the actions you can do through the AWS console to your data in S3. You can upload, you can download, you can delete it, and you can create pre-signed URLs, right? To get to your S3 bucket, you need one of two things. So let's say I have data in my bucket that people in my lab need to share, or I want to share with another institution or something. To get to the data in that bucket, there's technically 3 ways. I didn't put the third way, which is to make it public. That's only if you had like a public data set that you are supposed to give to anyone in the world who wants to see it. That's not super common, but in research, it's more common than in like commercial or something. So that's not up here because it's kind of niche. And it's not usually something you want to do. But most of the time, you're going to either need an identity and access management, IAM for short, a user, a group, and a role, or a role. So what I've done here is I have logged in with my user account. You can see up here, that's my login to my AWS account. So if you had people in your lab who needed to upload and download stuff from your S3 bucket, create an IAM user for them in your AWS account, and then they can go to S3. You can restrict them with a policy that says, okay, well, you can log into the AWS console, but you can only get to the S3 service. And you can only do stuff on this bucket, like this one is Joel Moore - something bucket. And even finer than that, not only can you only do S3 and only this bucket, you can only do these actions like upload or maybe download. So you can get very fine grained. And I'm, of course, happy to help you if you have questions about making an IAM policy. There's a lot of pre-built ones. But you'll also see there's user, a group, and a role. So user is what I use to log in. Groups are groups of users. So if you have an IAM user in an AWS account already and say, oh, I need access to S3 if you didn't have it before, maybe whoever's running that AWS account for you can just put you in a group that has S3 permissions. Role is usually for things, not people. So if you have, let's say, an EC2 instance, EC2 or Elastic Compute Cloud, virtual machines. Let's say I have an EC2 instance. I have a script running on that instance, my research pipeline, and part of it is to upload the results back to the S3 bucket when it's done. You don't need to embed credentials into that. You can give it a role. So then the virtual machine has rights to the S3 bucket. But you, if you were to SSH into it or RDP into it, don't have any rights to the S3, right? So I can't get into the bucket. I don't need an AWS login. I can SSH into this machine, and this machine has privileges to upload or download from S3. So that is a great way to give people who may have no business creating new buckets, deleting buckets, creating EC2 instances, say, okay, well, I do this in the lab, which means all I need to do is SSH into this Linux server, and the Linux server itself has access to the bucket. Now, the other way is a pre-signed URL. So this is, like, you can read the text, of course, but it is a temporary access to it. So you're not making your bucket public. You're not creating a new user, IAM user or role or group, in order to access that object in your bucket, but you're giving someone a link. And this link has rights to download that object only for a certain amount of time. And you can set the time limit. It can be, I think we keep increasing the limit. I think the limit is like a week now. Great way to provide temporary access. Now, I will say the security through obscurity part of pre-signed URLs is if you give anyone that URL, they can download it. So it's not authenticating a user. So if anyone has that link, they can download it, which is both good and bad. So you can create one pre-signed URL, and if there's 5 people who need that object, need to download that data, you just send the same link to everybody. They can all download it, say for the next half hour. Right? You can make super short ones too, and that kind of mitigates any problems of it, like someone sending it out to someone who's not supposed to have that link. Make them short, and in fact, that's how a lot of like e-commerce apps work. Is it uses a pre-signed URL, but it's so short that it initiates download immediately, or it doesn't work. Right, so you don't have enough time to send that to someone else for them to download it too if you're not supposed to. But that's beside the point. Pre-signed URLs, very easy to do. I use them all the time. And like, especially if I ever send any of you, I hate email attachments. I used to be an email administrator in my past life, which is why I have a lot of gray in my beard. So this way you don't have to, especially if something is really big. You have a giant data set or a PDF or something that would make it through your attachment size limit, send them a pre-signed URL. And we've come a long way, and I'll show a live demo of how we do it. But one of the options here, this is just a static image. I'll show you later after I get through the slides, how to do it in the console, but you click a button and create a pre-signed URL. It used to be a command line only thing, but it's not anymore. This is very easy. All right, any questions on the AWS console? One thing I should point out about the AWS console is it's convenient, it's easy to use, but if you have a bulk data upload or download, not a great tool. And it's mostly because of the limitations of your web browser. I mean, everybody has 1,000 tabs open. And it like, I know Chrome, I hate Chrome, I don't use Chrome, but Chrome itself just running takes up like a quarter of all the available system memory. So then it kind of crashes if you said, I want to download 3 terabytes of data through the web console, your browser is going to freak out. Just so you know. All right. Any questions? Yes.
Is there sort of like this hypothetical notion of folders secretly just being file names? Is there a limit to the directory depth, or like is there like basically a limit to the file name or the object name length?
Yes, there is a character limit. I don't remember it off the top of my head because it's voluminous. It's not a limit I run into, but I'll make a note to look it up.
So like basically don't worry about it, and also folders aren't real anyway, so don't put too much stock in folders when using this stuff. Yeah, because in S3, because it's accessed programmatically, you can categorize your data in lots of different ways using that prefix. If you use something that is trying to be useful to humans, it will present that prefix as a folder structure. Follow-up question then about IAM. Can you create IAM policies that give people selective get or put access based on various criteria?
Yes, you can.
Nice.
Yep, and I'll show it when I get to the console. But yeah, you can say you can do a get, but only for coming from this IP.
But like, could you do a get for only specific objects?
Yes.
Cool.
Yeah, you can say only things with this prefix, or only things with this, like this string pattern.
Yeah.
That you can't put like full on regex in your policy, but you know, you can wildcard and say, folder name, folder that isn't really a folder 1 star. Yeah.
Any online questions?
Okay, cool. So the second way is API. Now, I brought up Bodo because for Python, because that's by far the most popular, but most languages you can think of, we have an SDK for. So this is just to have something on the screen, really. You can access your data in S3 via, because it's made to be accessed programmatically, this is a great way to do it if you're already writing Python code. So if you're writing like Python code for your experimentation pipeline, you can access your S3 bucket with a Bodo command. And we have lots and lots of documentation on it, like copy object, create bucket, all the things you can do, because everything at AWS is an API call, whether it looks like it or not. So all the web console, it's all API calls, it's just through a web UI. So this way you can program directly your actions that you want to take on your data in AWS. Any questions about API access? An API access will use access keys and secret keys. So like I didn't read my own slide there. So IAM access with an access key and secret key. So in IAM, you can give this to a human. If you create a user and have an access key and secret key, and then use that as the credentials to make API calls to that bucket. Now, that's not always the best way to do it because you don't really want embedded static credentials anywhere. That's a bad idea. So because people post their keys to GitHub, so don't do that. But the other one is simple token service, which I will not get into. That's its own thing. But what you do is you make a call to the simple token service to assume an IAM role, which I mentioned earlier, that will have the permissions to do what it needs to do. And this access key and secret key are not visible to your human eyes. It is encrypted and in memory and auto rotates. You have requested a token, hence the T and the STS, and your API call uses that token for authentication, but you don't have static credentials sitting on a disk somewhere or in a file, right? This will of course makes more sense to people who do program regularly, but just if you can get away with not using access key, secret key, please use STS instead. If you can't, then secure that access key and secret key somehow. So assuming a role, putting it on an EC2 instance that's locked down. The next one, probably the second most common after the web UI, is the AWS command line. So the AWS command line, it's available for most operating systems. I always make sure to say most in case someone comes up with something super weird.
Is it available on Plan 9?
No. But if you want to compile it for Plan 9, absolutely good. I actually got this stupid thing to work on Solaris once. Not a modern version, but so it is Python based. So while it's not Python, you're not using Python commands, it's built on Python. So you have to have Python installed. You just do a pip install the AWS CLI. You'll need an access key and secret key to use the CLI, or if you're running the CLI on something that has a role. I mean, that's getting pretty deep, but basically you on your local laptop running Linux, Windows, Mac OS, I think BSD, it works. Basically, installing this is easy if you have Python. If Python will run on it and you can get the libraries it needs, you can run on that operating system. So you download it, you use your access key and secret key, and then you can run commands like this. So pretty easy to use for most operations. Things like AWS is to invoke a tool, the service you want S3, and then I have sync. So it works much like rsync. Say, I want to sync what's on my laptop to my S3 bucket. That's all you need. And then I've got this, there's a whole host of switches you can add, but --delete means delete stuff in the bucket that isn't in my local. Like if I had a previous sync and there's something in the bucket that's not local, delete it. But I purposely put this here because it's not the default. So if you're using the AWS CLI and you do an S3 sync, it will not by default be deleting anything on the destination on S3, right? So don't worry about it. If you say, oh no, something is there, isn't there that should be, things like that, don't worry about it. It only will delete if you put that flag on it. And you can do it the other way around too. So let's say, a new PI in my lab comes in, they want the data set locally. Yeah, just sync it, download it. And the sync will create, if you have a folder structure, because locally, if I sync from my laptop to the S3 bucket, it's going to have a folder structure most likely, unless I'm just syncing the contents of one folder. That will create in the web UI what looks like a folder structure in your S3 bucket. It's really just making prepending folder names to the object names. But that's why many slides ago, I had that default macOS empty file, library file, that because I did a sync. It's just, if you ever use Mac, you'll see that shows up in all your folders, it syncs it. So that's why you get stuff like that, because I did a sync between a file system. I didn't do a straight API call or even a direct upload of individual objects. I did a sync. It synced everything in the folder, and that's how I got that. There's lots and lots and lots of commands, so I won't go over all of them, but I picked some examples here. This is how you can make a pre-signed URL from the command. So let's say you wanted to write a quick bash script to create a bunch of pre-signed URLs. You could, or most likely you'd be writing a Python script. You could do it with the AWS CLI. So you wouldn't have to use the Bodo API or anything like that. You can still write scripts to do this. Same thing with PowerShell. Yeah.
Do you need working DNS to resolve an S3 bucket URL or something? Like I noticed that this is just like S3:// my bucket. There's no mention of the fact that this is hosted on AWS or anything. So I'm just interested in how that resolves to the actual IP address that serves the information.
Right. Whatever your external DNS is going to resolve.
Yeah.
Now, if I'm being very pedantic about it, you could technically have a truly bizarre setup where you can get to the internet, but you have no internet resolution.
Yeah. But
that would be a tremendous amount of work to set up like that, and no reason to do that.
Sure.
Basically, if you can get out to the internet, it's going to resolve.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so how does my bucket turn into a URL? Because I guess I'm asking because I know there are other object storage services out there that are quote S3 compatible. And very often in non-AWS tooling, we throw around S3 URLs that look like this, but refer to other storage hosts. And so I guess I'm interested in what connects S3:// my bucket to AWS.
Yeah, for us, if you create a bucket in S3 in AWS, it has to be DNS compliant for its name, and it has to be globally unique.
Okay.
So we will check when you create a bucket, if there's anything else on the internet with a public DNS of that bucket name, you can't create it.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah. Cool. So that can, if you tried to create a bucket on S3 that's like University of Washington, I guarantee that's already taken. So that's why it has to be globally unique, and that catches people off guard sometimes. Yeah. But you just make something up. Doesn't matter.
Do you guys ever have trouble with people name squatting buckets?
Yes.
Oh man.
That was a thing. When I joined in 2013, that was still kind of a thing. It's not really anymore. It happens, but usually there's going to be a trademark lawyer who's going to go after you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, we typically don't have much to do with it. Yep. Unless it's like slander, like Jeff Williams sucks. Isn't that the name of my?
Only text files
Only a
with
matter of
stupid names for
opinion.
Jeff Williams.
But yeah, you can, but they have to be DNS compliant too. So like you have to use only approved characters, and you can't use capitals, things like that. Can't start with a space. Stuff like that. And then if you look at the documentation, there are two sets of S3 CLI commands. There's regular S3, which is your more basic stuff, put, get, copy, delete. Pre-sign is one of them. Then there's S3 API, where instead of like I showed earlier, using like the Bodo SDK to make a Python-based API call, you can do the same actions as you would through the Bodo API, the C++ API, the .NET API, but through here, so you're not actually having to write code in .NET or TypeScript or whatever, right? It's a larger, more detailed set of actions you can do with the S3 API. You wouldn't get in what I've seen for at least research use cases, you probably won't get too deep into this unless you're an application developer. But one of them that is useful is like get bucket policy. Bucket policy says who can get to the bucket. Now there's a myriad of ways of getting to an S3 bucket via bucket policy. I'm not here to talk about bucket policies or endpoints, S3 endpoints or global endpoints or something. That's a whole other topic. That's permissions based, not getting to your files, which was the kind of the point of this. But yeah, I type that in, get bucket policy, -- bucket, and then your bucket name. You can see the bucket policy. Okay, so that was all interfacing with your data directly that's in S3, right? Maybe you only use S3 for backup and archive. You may only do it once. You could do it through the AWS CLI, push your data, do a sync, maybe even set a cron job locally that does a sync. Great. Now let's say I have needs beyond that, right? This is live data. This isn't archive data. This isn't cold data. But beyond that, I'm not or can't make direct calls to S3. It's just not how my application works, or not how the humans that I work with work. So maybe you need a file system interface. Maybe you have an application that is used to going to like the D drive, like you give it a path, a local path to get to your data. You can do that with S3 in a number of ways. So first off, we're going to talk about Amazon S3 File Gateway. Now, File Gateway, like it says there, is a virtual machine that you run locally. Let's go with locally first. I'll talk about EC2 based in a second. That presents a file system interface to your S3 bucket. So on the back end, all the data is stored in S3, but there's a virtual machine. Fun fact, it used to be BSD based. It's now Amazon Linux based. That interfaces with the bucket. So you don't have to talk to the bucket directly, right? You don't have to learn the AWS CLI. You don't have to use API calls, things like that. You say, here's a virtual machine that I've created locally, whether that's on a server in your lab or UW infrastructure somewhere. You're running a virtual machine that will present a mount point. So either SMB for Windows or NFS for Linux. And it is one or the other. It won't do both simultaneously, though you can have two file gateways going to the same bucket if you needed both. Now, because it's not, S3 is not a file system, well, it doesn't have permissions like a normal file system would. So what we do is we translate the POSIX permissions and put them in the metadata of your S3 objects. If you have no idea what any of that means, doesn't matter. You don't really have to care about it. It's just informational. Long story short is if you have permissions on the files in your file system and you copy them to S3 via a file gateway, it's going to keep most of those permissions. If you have really detailed like NTFS permissions from a Windows share, that's beyond the scope. These are POSIX permissions. So like I said here, it requires a virtual machine. So it's very convenient. It's very easy to use. It doesn't cost that much, but it does have to be consistently running, right? It's not something you could spin it up and then turn it down when you're not using it. But that unless you're only doing like a monthly thing or something like that, it's better to keep it running all the time. So you would need some sort of infrastructure, even if it's just a machine in your lab. I wouldn't do it on your laptop because when you close the lid, it's going to turn it off. But you just have a machine of modest horsepower that will run the file gateway virtual machine, which will then act as the interface. You don't need anything else. That's it. It talks to the S3 bucket for you. It has a local cache. So frequently accessed files, if everyone in the department is accessing the same file every day, it's going to be an S3, but it's also going to be hot in the local cache of the storage gateway, file gateway. It's not a super sophisticated algorithm. It's last access was based. So hot stuff stays in the cache. Though I will say, if you're accessing it from like campus, the latency is so ridiculously low between here and AWS that you'll never probably even notice a cache miss, right? So if something is not in a local cache, it's going to go out to S3 automatically. You don't have to do anything and pull it down for you. And most likely you won't notice if it's a cache miss. It is TLS2 encrypted in transit, so you don't have to worry about that. It's encrypted in transit, encrypted at rest in the cache. And that's all you really need. Right? You don't have to set up anything in the bucket other than having a bucket. So when you set up your file gateway, say, this is my bucket. If you have when you're setting up the gateway through the AWS console, if you have the right permissions to create a storage gateway, it's going to connect to the bucket, no problem. Now, I have this here because you can run a file gateway VM in EC2, which is our virtual compute platform. So you can run it in that. So if you had, let's say, an application running in EC2 that had to have a file system interface, but you wanted to use S3 because of, it's durable, it's very inexpensive. I don't need super crazy high IO, right? I'm just pulling in things, doing what I need to, pushing out the results. You can run it in EC2. So if you have an EC2 based workload and you need a file system interface to S3, you can spin up a storage gateway in EC2. Works great. If you did not want to have a file gateway locally, running locally, you could have an EC2 based file gateway, but then you would need a VPN between whatever network you're on, most likely campus, and your AWS environment. So if you already had that for some reason, then absolutely you can run it in EC2 and it's going to go over the VPN to get to this. If you're running this locally, there's no need for a VPN. It can talk in an encrypted way to the bucket directly. So I know that's getting in the weeds, but if you're like, yeah, this sounds really attractive, but I don't have a place to run it locally, then talk to me. We'll come up with another solution.
Yes. What size VM on EC2 would you use for that gateway?
I would use an M series, like medium or large, like, yeah. 8 and 16.
Cool.
Yeah. The next is something that's fairly new. We call it mount point for S3. Now, it's in our documentation. It's fully supported. When you ask me about it, I can walk you through it. But it is an open source project, right? So it's not like most things I'm talking about here, where it's an AWS service, right? S3 mount point is a way on your system or on a virtual machine, basically any Linux or Windows system. You can have a mount point. You install the client, mount point client, and it presents an S3 bucket as a file system interface, like as a file system. Now, this is only available to the system that you have the mount point client on, right? This isn't like for everybody in the department. It is surprisingly quick. It's very good at pulling stuff from S3 into some sort of scratch space where it's going to be processed, right? Because S3 is where you put stuff before or after you do something to it. you can't really modify S3 data live, right? So mount point does exactly what it sounds like. You mount it, it looks like a file system, you interact with it like a file system. It is surprisingly quick. Now, the reason I'm mentioning that is because there have been things out there for many years, basically since S3 existed. People have been making projects to try and make S3 look like a file system. And almost all of them use something called Fuse. I don't remember, I should have looked up what the acronym Fuse stands for, but irrelevant. Fuse sucks and it is slow. And I have had customers say, oh, I stopped using S3 because, oh, I'm like, well, why? I was using this thing that made it look like a file system, that like added it as a drive on my Mac. I'm like, oh, okay. That's why you think S3 is slow and sucks. It is not. It's not S3. It is these Fuse clients. This started with some of the ideas that Fuse does and has been like, it's so far beyond, because I've talked to the people who developed this. Because I even said in an intro, I'm like, Fuse sucks. Is this Fuse based? And they're like, kinda. It started there, but it's unrecognizable now. So mount point mounts it, looks like a file system, but it's really an S3 bucket. It's pretty quick and it's free. And you can look at the code too, because it's on GitHub. Okay, next is my super tiny header. I don't know, I don't know why. Third-party options. Yeah, I'm not a designer. Sorry. These aren't all going to be pretty, but I will say I'm not doing the typical Amazon thing where you have slides full of single-spaced 8-point font text that fill up every single slide. It's a visual medium, so we're here for. S5 CMD. It is a open source project. We don't have anything to do with it. I'm sure somebody at Amazon has contributed to it before, but it is not made by us. And it is a high-speed parallel S3 command line tool. This, unlike the AWS CLI, the AWS CLI is versatile. It's the Swiss Army knife. It is not the honed, balanced chef's knife for S3. Why I make that comparison is because you can do the bulk of what you want to do with the AWS CLI, but because it's Python-based, it does not parallelize very well. And I don't mean parallel uploads and downloads. I mean parallelization of threads for the task of uploading and downloading. So if you have a bulk data upload or bulk data download, the AWS CLI will work. It may not be the quickest option. This, I have done many speed tests, and it is double, sometimes triple the speed of the AWS CLI. It's written mostly in Go and C. So go out there, it's free, open source, you can contribute to it, it's on GitHub. And these are the kind of things you can expect from it, right? LS, list buckets and objects, copy, remove. It's really very similar to using the AWS CLI or even using common Linux command line tools. And there is a sync, as you'll see, sync objects. It works the same as the sync I was talking about before. So if you ever used rsync, it's going to be a very similar experience.
SQL queries?
Yeah. That's interesting.
I won't ask.
Yeah. I don't personally have a use for it, but it is a thing it can do. I read it. I've not tried it. But yeah, you can run SQL queries and objects because you could do that in AWS with Athena, right? That's what Athena is. Yeah, on a side note, we have something called Athena. If the data you have in S3 is formatted in a certain way, so it's all CSV files, let's say, or all JSON files, you can run a SQL query on the data in S3 without ever ingesting it into a database. It's going to run it directly on the objects. Okay. So S5 CMD, very quick, open source. I like it. It's kind of my go-to for speed tests and bulk uploads and stuff. The other one, it's washed out on the projector, but it says rclone. It says it right here. Yeah, there's a difference between my screen and the projector. Sorry. So rclone is another open source project. So while S5 CMD is specifically for S3 and S3 compatible storage services, rclone is a more general data transfer tool, because you can use it like in on-premises systems to copy from one file system to another. You can even use it on your own system, like to copy from one directory to another. It's a very robust tool. It has a little bit more setup than S5 CMD or the AWS CLI, where you just kind of insert access key and secret key and are done with it. rclone has a little bit more setup involved, but it has a lot more options. And it does, at least in my experience, it does better with things like interruptions, right? Let's say something interrupted, the upload and download, resuming, things like that, data integrity. It's got a lot more features to get information on that kind of stuff. So another great, if you're doing more than just hey, I need to upload this. Let's say I have a big project for a data migration. Look into rclone, another open source project. Okay, so this is all great for nerds, right? But what if you're a human who's like, I just need to get this from here to there. I don't care about APIs. I don't ever want to type something on a command line. Then there's an open source project called CyberDuck. I love their logo, so I made it really big. But it works very much. It is a graphical interface. So you tell it your S3 bucket name, and then your access key and secret key that you created in IAM to give it access, and that's it. And then you drag and drop. If you've ever used like old school FTP clients, like graphical FTP clients, it's going to be very familiar to you. Now, of course, it works with a whole bunch of other storage systems that are inferior and you shouldn't use, but it has worked with S3 since its inception. Like I said, this is open source and free, and it's a drag and drop. Like it'll look like on your desktop a drive that you can double click on, drag things in. Works great. If you're looking for top speed performance, this is not the tool. If you're looking for usability for human beings and ease of use, this is it. There used to be a free application for all the Windows folks out there. CyberDuck will run on Windows now. It didn't used to. It does now. Cloudberry was the kind of Windows alternative, very similar to this, except not open source. It's kind of gone now. It's been crippled in favor of their commercial product. But CyberDuck, that's the way to go for ease of use, graphical interface. Okay, any questions on those? No. Okay. So Globus, there is a Globus connector for S3. It isn't what I would say, it isn't something that most people are going to use. But if you are a heavy Globus user already, or you know the ins and outs of Globus, this is probably your best option, right? Because you already know how to use it. You've set up Globus before. There is a connector for S3. It isn't free, but I think it comes with a certain subscription level of Globus. That's kind of too deep into Globus for my knowledge. But I have lots of customers who use it. They like it. Easy, if you already use Globus. Okay, traditional backup vendors. So if your whole point is to back up data, and this is probably more relevant to an IT department than researchers, but I wanted to point them out. So let's say you're running a lab with multiple PIs or multiple systems, multiple different experiments, different funded by different people, but yet you're in charge of all their data. Commvault, Veeam, Rubrik, Backup Exec, Net Backup, all the Veritas stuff. Those all have integration with S3. So if you have a IT data center and you use a traditional backup application to back things up, they all work with S3 these days. So just wanted to mention that there's a plugin. Veeam is very common in higher education and in education in general. Rubrik, Commvault, they all have really good. Commvault is always the first to implement new features of S3 into their backup software. Now, if you've never experienced this kind of stuff, that's fine. You can ignore this slide. This would be the stuff that is backing up servers or even backing up endpoints like this. It does dedupe compression. You know, in the old days, you would write to tape. Now you don't write to tape, you write to S3, right? But another thing I wanted to mention on this slide is plugins for NAS, network attached storage. So let's say in your office, you have a Synology or a QNAP or a Netgear or something, and you want to back up what's on there. Most of them have a plugin. So Synology, QNAP, both of those, I've installed both. Very easy to do. You say, this is my bucket, this is an access key and secret key. Back up my Synology. And it does. Give it a schedule. And you have to do very little. You don't have to worry about command lines. You don't have to worry about virtual machines or anything. You just download the plugin through their interface. There you go. Back up your NAS. So any questions on those? Nope. Okay. So I'll put this back up later. That is my email address should you want to reach out. And now I will change my sharing. Find right window. Share this. Okay, hopefully people can see. It is sharing, but it's not showing up here. Let me fix that. Expand my display. Zoom. Go, mirror it. If there's a key command to enable that and someone knows it, let me know. Ah, okay. So some of the things I wanted to show you is we'll go to S3. And these are a list of my buckets. This should look familiar. This is from the screenshot. And let's say I wanted to here look at this reInvent, which is our big conference in November. Here it is. Here's my this object. I can copy the S3 URL right there. This is the object URL. So if I were to make this public on purpose, change the permissions and make it public, I could just give anybody that URL and they could see this object. E-tag is for data integrity checks, which I don't know. Go into here. But I can see the size. Key is what we call an object name. And then here's bucket properties and everything. But versioning. Yeah, this isn't really an S3 talk, but versioning is something where I can have multiple versions of an object. But I can do things here like download. And it is downloaded. There we go. That is the object downloaded. Opening it, if I click the open button, it does basically the same thing. If it's something like download is for something that you know won't be rendered in the browser, open will open it in another tab. But object actions are all the things you can do in the web console. I can copy it. I can share with pre-signed URL. So I can set how many minutes. Say I can set 2 minutes. I can create pre-signed URL, copy that pre-signed URL. Then I could share that out. Your message is too long. Okay, well, you get the trust me. If I sent you that URL, you'd be able to download.
How long is the URL? You just opened it.
Oh, it is that long.
Okay, it's pretty bad.
It has hashed keys in it. So
Okay.
yeah. So then if I hit enter, I can get to it. Now that's object stuff. If I went to my bucket, I can click create folder, and it will create a folder. I'm super creative today. Create folder. And you can see folder here. I can click on it, and there are no objects in it. But I could put an object in it, so I'll click upload. I can add files, or I can add a folder. So
If
yeah.
folders don't really exist, then how can a folder exist without anything? Like, is there some metadata in the bucket that says a given folder is there?
Yes,
Okay,
you have a 0 byte object of the folder name.
okay.
Yeah.
And can we attach metadata to a folder? Like of any kind, or
Not really, no.
really likely?
Yeah. You can't even in the web console see the folder object. If you did like an API call, you could. But yeah, if you needed to pre-create a folder structure in like programmatically, let's say I wouldn't need to create like this 50-layer deep folder structure before I start copying stuff. So if you did sync, it's going to create it. But if you wanted it to be there before you start putting data in, you would create 0 byte objects. And we've got instructions how to do that. Yep. So I just uploaded a file, or I added a file that I want to add to my folder. I can click upload, and it's going to upload it. It is not small. It's a PowerPoint. But just give you an idea of how this works. And almost done. There we go. So I have uploaded a file. I can see it in my folder here. There it is. And this may be all you need. You know, if this is just like, hey, I've got some data I want to back up or I want to share with someone else, click upload, upload it, share out pre-signed URLs, done, right? So I wanted to show what it was like to do that in the web console. And oh, I see we're kind of at time, but any questions? Anything else you'd like to see? As I get my power adapters. Now, another topic that I knew we wouldn't have time for is I've showed you options to use a file system interface for S3. But what if you have need for an actual file system, right? You have virtual machines that are going to be reading and writing, and they need a file system, like a high performance parallel file system or high performance compute. There are options to interface with file systems from on premises. They do involve a networking component. There's also something called file cache. AWS file cache, where if you have the local NFS share, you can then use Amazon file cache, which will push it up to the cloud for you, and then have it so you can run your compute in the cloud without having to do a data transfer, right? It is transferring the data, but you didn't have to manually move the data. So I'm not going into that, but if you want to talk about file systems as file systems, not data in S3 that you interface as if it were a file system, then that's a whole other topic, and I'd love to talk about that too. Same thing with accessing data in an EC2 instance or in a container. That's more networking, right? And accessing data in AWS in a database, there are things you can do remotely. There's things you can do in the cloud. As I mentioned earlier, there's Athena, which if the data in S3 is of a specific format, so JSON, Parquet, CSV, you can query the information in those files without having a database at all. You just have data in S3, files and a bunch of CSVs in S3. You can use Athena to make a SQL query of the data within those files. So, and that would be something that if you are interested in it, we should have a conversation. I can run a workshop about how Athena works. It's really cool. But long story short, getting data to and from S3 doesn't have to be difficult. It doesn't have to be daunting. It doesn't have to involve a whole bunch of piping of networking. And it doesn't have to be scary that S3 is not a file system, right? So that's all I got. Any final questions? Any wildly unrelated questions about AWS? Nope. Okay. They were good. All right.
Thank you, everybody.
Yes. Thank you for your time, everybody. Thanks.
Thank you, Phil.
Thank you.